Hello, welcome back everyone. We are now going to go into the second part of our session on the pandemic and comparative perspective. We will be turning to the Southern Cone now, and we begin with Sebastián Lipina. ¿Qué tal, Sebastián? Un placer. Who is from the Consejo Nacional de Investigación, CONICET. And he will be giving a paper on the pandemic and children's psychosocial development in Latin America. Welcome, bienvenido. Momentito, just a moment. We're not hearing you.
Now you are hearing me, I'm sure, because I was on mute. I'm sorry.
Good
morning, Carola. Good morning, Carola. Good morning, Marcelo. Thank you for this invitation to you, to Professor Samagni, and the other members of the Academy for the opportunity to be here and share this information. So I will share my presentation now, and I will stop my video just to be sure that the connectivity is, okay? Let me check that. Yes. So can you see my presentation now?
No, not yet.
Not yet? Oh. Okay. Let me check.
We'll let you know in the moment it appears. There it is.
Perfect. So let me check that all is okay. It is running. Coming.
We see the first slide.
Okay, perfect. All is right. Thank you. What I did to prepare this presentation was reviewing the literature on how the pandemic impacted child and adolescent psychosocial development in Latin America. In this context, I will refer to psychosocial in a broad way as different emotional, cognitive, and social processes involved in any developmental context, which children and adolescents use for adaptive purposes. For such a name, I have run several bibliographic searches in PubMed, EBSCO, Google Scholar, governmental and non-governmental and multilateral organizations website, an abstract presented at Conference on Child and Adolescent Development between November 2021 and the first week of February 2022. As a result of this bibliographic research, I consulted 174 empirical papers, reports, and perspectives. The first thing that I verified was the little empirical material collected experimentally related to the impact of the pandemic on psychosocial development. With experimentally, I mean information based on the implementation of methods and techniques that developmental science usually uses to explore psychosocial processes. As in almost the entire world, scientific activity was also widely interrupted since the beginning of the pandemic. And in general, there were many difficulties in resuming field work until today, as well as in carrying out remote studies more specific than surveys. Some research groups began to make changes in their methodologies and to carry out virtual studies that are still under development. In any case, such kind of efforts did not occur to the same extent that in industrialized countries, such as, for example, USA or European countries. Based on the reviewing of the abstract of some of the main international conferences on child development, I could anticipate that new scientific literature on the topic will begin to appear during this year from some Latin American countries. This means that to date, there is no experimental published material of this type in Latin America, and that the information available comes mainly from reports made by government, NGOs, think tanks, and multilateral organizations, such as, for example, UNICEF, UNDP, ICLAC, and IDB, which is based on surveys conducted virtually or remotely. So it's important to consider that this information does not allow us to measure adequate prevalences or mechanisms. Most of the available information today corresponds to the first year of the pandemic. In most cases, the impacts refer to the effects of the implementation of lockdowns. And in few countries, follow-up rounds are verified between 3 and 5 months after the start of confinement. I will give you some examples of that. The information on the effects of the pandemic on child psychosocial development in later stages of the pandemic when vaccination and reopening of schools were verified, is still being collected or analyzed. In general, in Latin America, the implementation of studies of surveys applying longitudinal design is not frequent. Although there is available indirect information on such aspects collected by some observatories, the type of indicators that are used are approximations to such phenomena, but not direct information from children and adolescents on the performance or state of their psychological development. In summary, the bay-level information that I will share now don't necessarily imply decreases or increases in cases, but rather the difficulties in the detection capacity as a consequence of the caregivers' perceptions under stress reports. Latin America has been a region characterized by high levels of socioeconomic inequity for decades. Actually, is still considered the region with the highest income inequity in the world, in which the richest 10% own about 20% of the wealth. The progressive deterioration of socioeconomic factors before the pandemic significantly reduced social protection. Almost 50% of the economically active population gained its living in the informal sector with high gender gaps in labor participation. According to ECLAC UNICEF, the projection of monetary poverty for children and adolescents in the region in 2020 was 51%, and more than 65% of children lived in homes without access to social security. Until February 2020, the most critical threats to children were those derived from the crisis in climate, poverty, migration, malnutrition, lack of access to adequate housing, education, social protection, and the commercial marketing of harmful products. In other words, before the pandemic, the people in the region were not able to meet minimum health and human development standards, which already posed a risk to the development of children and adolescents, especially those who were in situations of vulnerability. A summary of the reviewed literature on impacts at the microsystemic level show us the following scenario. Loss of income in a range of 30 to 69%, increase of debts, job instability and informality, increase in governmental reception of cash transfers in a range of 26 to 59%, suspension in the purchase of reduction of food portions in a range of 30 to 60%, increased signs of anxiety and depression in caregivers in a range of 15 to 85%, gender violence and domestic burden on women, and reports of concern in caregivers regarding job demands, unemployment and job instability, decreased income, low emotional control in the face of uncertainty, fear of contagion and death, contagion on the return to schools in children and adolescents, self-regulation and behavioral problems in children and adolescents, especially in single-parent homes, organization of time and routines at home, and loss of learning opportunities. At the ontosystemic level, that is, at the individual level of children and adolescents, the scenario was the following: sleep and feeding alterations, suspension of health controls in a range of 17 to 65%, suspension of immunizations in a range of 4 to 35%, increasing communication problems inside homes in a range of 7 to 34%, increased expression of anger and fights inside homes in a range of 15% to 59%, decreasing times and spaces for play, increasing scene exposure in a context of about 30 to 40% of lack of access to internet, mourning for death of a family member, an increase in signs of anxiety and depression in a range of 10 to 60%. Regarding changes in these signs throughout the pandemic stages, some reports show differences among countries and vulnerable groups. For example, in Colombia and Mexico, these values were maintained at the same levels after the end of the confinements in 2020. In Argentina, reductions of 17% in anxiety and 6% in depression were verified after the long confinement of 2020. And in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Colombia, and Peru, this type of incidence was greater in children who were victims of violence. As in other many regions in the world, even considering the limited available information in Latin America, the pandemic has disrupted the functioning of systems that support human well-being and development at many levels, from individual biology to families, healthcare, education, local and national governments, economies, and many other interconnected systems in profound and varying ways. So the pandemic represents a psychosocial systemic shock. Although the initial measures of physical distancing made it possible to contain the contagion, they also confined a large proportion of caregivers, children, and adolescents to their homes. Consequently, this increased children's exposure to parental job loss, income instability, and its effects on the dynamics of emotional interaction inside homes. In turn, this phenomenon made the distribution of tasks within the homes and the care of children more complex. In addition, childcare and educational programs have been disrupted, imposing challenges to parents and children's self-regulatory and learning development. This drastically limited the possibilities of teachers and other caregivers, not only to teach and to care, but to detect mental health issues and cases of violence, to provide contention and to advise to children. And of course, to activate primary and secondary prevention procedures. From a psychosocial perspective, perhaps one of the hallmarks of the pandemic has been the extent to which it has impacted the predictability of daily life. There is an extensive scientific literature showing that lack of predictability and control can have long-term effects on biological stress and immune system responses, two of the main mechanisms involved in emotional and cognitive self-regulation processing. In summary, also in Latin America, the pandemic can be conceptualized as a set of unanticipated and uncontrollable chronic stressors that are detrimental to the mental health of children, adolescents, and caregivers, particularly in those with disability from migrant, refugee, cultural and ethnically diverse and socioeconomically deprived communities. In this sense, the generation COVID can be conceptualized as one exposed to an unprecedented exacerbation of psychosocial stressors, which impacts on mental health and well-being are expected to last years in the context of an insufficient planning and investment in mental health policies and services. Consequently, such a tsunami of psychosocial stressors may impact several self-regulatory competencies for coping with adaptation challenges in the immediate future. Any consideration of such a complex problem necessarily requires a relational perspective approach, which should involve a complex set of planning and actions to allow the identification of variable trajectories of psychosocial development, eventually expressed by different vulnerable groups exposed to known and new constellation of risks and opportunities, and consequently orient the corresponding and adequate intervention. To conclude, I would like to share some possible future directions that could be useful in facing the challenges that the pandemic imposes on the psychosocial development of children, adolescents, and caregivers of the generation COVID in Latin America. Regarding the conceptual understanding of the available information, although insufficient, it is possible to interpret it in a preliminary way from the pre-pandemic conceptual models based on a rich history of developmental theory and empirical research on ecological and family systems. However, the generation COVID imposes new challenges that could update and or modify previous theoretical proposals. Actually, the pandemic is teaching key lessons about how people respond to crisis and misinformation, and is promoting changes in the way scientists study public health questions. A full understanding of the impact of massive, everyday unpredictability over time will depend on the implementation of theoretical and analytical models that can capture, first, the multiple variable trajectories of different aspects of psychosocial development, second, at different levels of analysis, third, in different stages of development, and fourth, in different developmental contexts. Such capture of complexity necessarily requires updating methods of collection and analysis of the complexity of human development. In this sense, perhaps the generation COVID can be considered as a great opportunity to channel efforts that allow conceptual and methodological advances in the knowledge of psychosocial development in Latin America, and eventually in other regions, of course. At the moment, there is a need for research to address how mental health consequences for vulnerable groups can be mitigated under pandemic conditions. In more immediate stages, discovery, evaluation, and refinement of mechanistically driven interventions to address the psychological, social, and neuroscientific aspects of the pandemic are also required. Rising to this challenge will require integration across disciplines and sectors and should be done together with the people of our communities, including children and adolescents. Information collection efforts require methodological reconsiderations in terms of sampling, selection of specific indicators of psychosocial development, and periodic measurements or assessments. Such innovations could benefit from the specific financing of intersectoral efforts that involve different observatories of human development, researchers from different disciplines related to child development that already carry out their activities in the region, as well as other stakeholders and policymakers working in Latin America. In particular, such efforts would be of great value for the exploration and identification of onto, micro, and macro systemic impact mechanisms that could guide different upgradable intervention efforts. The continuous collection of information is a shortcoming in the region that requires specific financing planning. At the same time, that is a minimum requirement necessary to face the effects of the pandemic on mental health and emotional and cognitive development of the generation COVID in the short and long term. In addition, it is possible that during the development of the pandemic, other constellations of risks and resilience will emerge in caregivers, children, and adolescents of this generation COVID, which would require specific, different, and innovative solutions. Given the previous and current exposure to stressors that challenge the psychosocial development of children and adolescents, and the lack of adequate planning and investment in mental health policies and services in practically the entire region, one of the priority aspects is the provision of psychosocial care services and food security, which allow to prevent and treat mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and stress. Such immediate interventions should seek to also promote assertive and healthy parenting and communication practices between different social actors. In other words, innovation should include the concept of primary care in mental health that transcends the work in health centers, but any developmental context, including homes, schools, and neighborhoods. Although several countries have implemented portals and other information mechanisms, which are so important, they don't replace the provision of specific mental health interventions yet. It is possible that if conservative mindset will not prevail, this type of planning and actions will contribute to generating solutions to the effects of the pre-pandemic inequities on the emotional and cognitive development of children and adolescents. In this sense, multilateral efforts could consider the design of policies and investments in the context of the SDGs to help generate equity in access and mental health care and contribute to the psychosocial development. In such a context, the role of the academy in general, everywhere, must be oriented at least towards the support of continuous impact assessment, the generation of dynamic knowledge that can anticipate medium and long-term impacts, and to include the multiplicity of community voices in the research designs. Sorry? Carola, did you say something?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay, I am almost finishing. This requires also considering the development of algorithms that allow generating answers online. Instead, online is not, I don't mean with online through internet. Online is in live, instead of waiting for the completion of stages of the intervention. For all these efforts, the recommendations made by the WHO, UNICEF, Lancet commissioners in 2020, before the official beginning of the pandemic, remain valid. Put child health and well-being at the center of recovery plans, include experts on children issues in the relevant task forces and legislative working groups, engage ministries to work together for children, and ask children and adolescents what changes they would like to see. Finally, in my humble opinion, what is needed to face the challenges that the generation COVID presents us not only requires multilateral collaboration, innovation in financing and maintaining high quality clinical and research standards, but also, and probably most important, to base any effort on a moral, genuine premise of solidarity that can navigate the troubled waters of the pre-pandemic mechanisms of inequities that characterizes Latin America. Indeed, the Generation COVID crisis is also an opportunity. Thank you very much for your attention.